In 1945, Japan was not a country in decline. It was a country that had ceased to exist in any meaningful economic sense. Two cities had been erased from the map in a matter of seconds. A third of Tokyo had already been burned to the ground by firebombing raids months earlier. The country's industrial base, the shipyards, the steel mills, the factories lay in ruins. Inflation was so severe that the Japanese yen had lost nearly all of its value. People were trading cigarettes for food. The government had no money. The people had no hope. And the rest of the world had no reason to believe Japan would ever matter again. 30 years later, Japan was the second largest economy on the planet. This is not a story about luck. It is not a story about natural resources, because Japan has almost none. It is not a story about geography, because islands rarely become industrial superpowers. This is a story about decisions, brutal, deliberate, sometimes painful decisions made by a nation that chose survival over pride and progress over tradition. And in doing so, rewrote every assumption the world had ever made about how economies recover from catastrophe. To understand what Japan accomplished, you first have to understand what it lost. Before the war, Japan had been building an empire for decades. It had invaded China, seized territory across Southeast Asia, and positioned itself as the dominant military force in the Pacific. Its ambitions were vast. Its methods were brutal. And when the war finally ended in August 1945, it paid an almost unimaginable price. Over 3 million Japanese citizens were dead. Entire generations of young men had been lost. The merchant fleet that had once powered Japan's trade was sitting at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Industrial output had collapsed to levels not seen since the early 1900s. And for the first time in its history, Japan was occupied by a foreign power, to the United States, with no clear path forward and no guarantee of what tomorrow would look like. General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Tokyo with a mandate to rebuild Japan as a stable, democratic, non-threatening nation. What happened next was one of the most dramatic economic interventions in modern history. The Americans dismantled Japan's old military-industrial complex, rewrote its constitution, and attempted to restructure an entire society from the ground up. Some of it worked. Some of it created tensions that would take decades to resolve. But buried inside this occupation was something unexpected: the seeds of an economic philosophy that would eventually terrify the West. The first turning point came not from policy, but from geography. In 1950, war broke out on the Korean Peninsula, and suddenly, Japan, sitting just across the water, became the most strategically important supply base in the entire Pacific. The United States began pouring military procurement contracts into Japanese factories, steel orders, vehicle repairs, equipment manufacturing. Almost overnight, Japan's dormant industrial capacity roared back to life, not through Japanese initiative alone, but through the sheer demand of a war being fought next door. It was a brutal irony. A country destroyed by war was being rebuilt by someone else's. But Japan's leaders were watching carefully, and they understood something that would define the next 5 decades of economic policy. Demand, once ignited, could be directed. Growth, once started, could be engineered. The man most responsible for what came next was not a politician. His name was Hayato Ikeda, and in 1960, as Prime Minister, he announced something that sounded almost absurd given where Japan had been just 15 years earlier. He called it the Income Doubling Plan. The goal was simple and staggering: in equal measure, double the average Japanese income within 10 years. Not gradually, not eventually, within a decade. The plan worked. In fact, it was achieved ahead of schedule. Behind Ikeda's ambition was a system unlike anything the Western world had built. At the center of it sat a government ministry so powerful, so strategic, and so quietly effective that Western economists would spend decades trying to understand it. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry, known as MITI, was essentially a command center for the Japanese economy. It identified which industries Japan should dominate, directed capital toward them, protected domestic companies from foreign competition, and coordinated between government and business in ways that blurred every line the free market textbooks had ever drawn. MITI chose steel, then shipbuilding, then automobiles, then electronics. Each time, it picked an industry, concentrated national resources behind it, and waited for Japan to become world-class. Not competitive, world-class. The results were extraordinary. By the 1960s, Japan was building more ships than any other country on Earth. By the 1970s, Japanese cars were flooding American showrooms, fuel-efficient, reliable, affordable, and arriving at exactly the moment an oil crisis made American gas guzzlers look like expensive mistakes. By the 1980s, Sony, Toyota, Honda, Panasonic, and Toshiba were not just Japanese brands, they were global symbols of precision and quality. Japan had gone from rubble to dominance in a single generation. The climax of this story arrives in the 1980s, and it arrives with a kind of dizzying, almost hallucinatory energy. By 1985, Japan's economy was growing so fast, its trade surplus so enormous, that the United States, now running massive deficits, demanded action. In September of that year, finance ministers from the world's major economies gathered at the Plaza Hotel in New York and signed what became known as the Plaza Accord. The agreement forced Japan to allow its currency, the yen, to appreciate sharply against the dollar. Overnight, Japanese exports became more expensive. The competitive advantage that had powered 2 decades of growth was being deliberately compressed. Japan's response was to do what it had always done: adapt. The Bank of Japan slashed interest rates to stimulate the domestic economy, and what followed was one of the greatest asset bubbles in financial history. Money flooded into Japanese real estate and stock markets. Land prices in Tokyo rose to levels so absurd that the grounds of the Imperial Palace were theoretically worth more than the entire state of California. Companies were buying golf courses in Hawaii. Japanese investors were purchasing Rockefeller Center. The Nikkei stock index climbed vertically, year after year, as if gravity had stopped applying. At its peak in December 1989, Japan's total stock market was worth more than the entire United States stock market. A country roughly the size of California was, on paper, the most valuable economy in the world. And then it ended. The bubble burst in 1990 with a quiet, devastating thoroughness. The Nikkei lost nearly 40% of its value within months. Real estate collapsed. Banks that had lent recklessly against inflated assets found themselves holding loans that would never be repaid. The Japanese government, unwilling to force banks to confront their losses, allowed zombie institutions to limp forward. For years, lending to dying companies, refusing to acknowledge failure, preserving the appearance of stability while the underlying rot deepened. The decade that followed became known simply as the lost decade. Then it became 2 lost decades. Growth stalled, deflation set in. A generation of young Japanese entered a job market that had no room for them. The confidence that had defined Japan in the 1980s quietly dissolved. And yet Japan never collapsed. It remained one of the wealthiest, most technologically sophisticated, most socially stable countries on Earth. Its companies still led global industries. Its infrastructure was still the envy of the world. The fall from the peak was real. The disappearance that the rest of the world quietly predicted never came. What does Japan's story teach us? It teaches us that recovery is not passive. Japan did not rise from the ashes of 1945 because time healed its wounds. It rose because an entire society made a collective decision, often painful, often quiet, rarely celebrated, to prioritize the future over the present, to save instead of spend, to build instead of consume, to study what the world wanted and then make it better than anyone else could. It also teaches us that no system is permanent. The same discipline and coordination that built Japan's miracle also created the conditions for its bubble. The very strengths that made Japan extraordinary eventually became the rigidities that made adaptation difficult. Strength, taken too far, becomes fragility. But perhaps most powerfully, Japan teaches us this: the worst moment in a nation's history does not determine its future. What determines the future is what happens in the room after the worst moment, the decisions made in the silence after the catastrophe, when everything seems lost and every option looks impossible. Japan chose to rebuild, and the world has never quite looked the same since.